When I moved into my new apartment last month, I was excited about the fresh start, having just landed a job at a local tech company after graduating college. The first week was great. I was settling in, unpacking boxes, and getting to know the area. Then I met her, the woman who would become the bane of my existence. Let's call her Karen. It was one morning when I first encountered Karen. I was carrying groceries up to my apartment when she cornered me in the hallway. She asked if I was a new tenant in 3B, and when I confirmed, she immediately brought up my parking situation. I was confused. I had been assigned a parking spot when I moved in, and I always made sure to park there. When I asked what the problem was, Karen explained that she had been living there for 5 years and had always used 2 parking spots, one for her car and one for her husband's. I told her that I was assigned a spot when I moved in and that's the one I've been using. Karen then told me that the spot used to be her second spot and demanded that I park somewhere else. This woman expected me to give up my assigned parking spot just because she wanted an extra one. I refused, explaining that it was my assigned spot and I couldn't park anywhere else. Karen insisted that she deserved the spot because she had been there longer, suggesting that I could park on the street since I was young. I stood my ground, telling her that's not how it works, and that the landlord had assigned me that spot. Frustrated, Karen declared that she would speak to the landlord about the situation. With that, she took off, leaving me standing there with my groceries, completely baffled. Over the next few weeks, Karen made it her mission to make my life difficult. She would leave nasty notes on my car, complain about non-existent noise from my apartment, and even tried to convince other neighbors that I was a troublemaker. One day I came home to find her car parked in my spot. I was furious. I called the landlord immediately. I explained the situation to him, mentioning that my neighbor had parked in my assigned spot and had been harassing me about it for weeks. The landlord recognized who I was talking about and apologized for the situation, promising to take care of it right away. True to his word, the landlord came by within the hour. I watched from my window as he spoke to Karen, who was gesticulating wildly and pointing at my apartment. Eventually, she got in her car and moved it, but not before shooting me a death glare. A few days later, I heard a knock at my door. It was a police officer. He told me that they had received a noise complaint from one of my neighbors and asked what was going on. Surprised, I told him I had been sitting quietly, watching TV at a low volume. The officer asked if he could come in and take a look, which I allowed. He quickly realized there was no disturbance. As he was leaving, Karen appeared in the hallway, looking smug. Karen insisted to the officer that I had been blasting music all night. The officer, having seen the truth for himself, told Karen not to make false reports as there was no loud music or any disturbance in my apartment. Angry, Karen retreated to her apartment, slamming the door behind her. The next day, I decided I'd had enough. I went to the landlord's office with a list of all the incidents involving Karen. The landlord listened patiently, taking notes. He apologized for what I had been through and mentioned that Karen had been a problem for other tenants as well. He said he thought it was time they took action. A week later, I saw Karen moving out. The landlord had decided not to renew her lease due to multiple complaints from various tenants. As she was loading the last of her boxes, she saw me and couldn't resist one last jab. She accused me of ruining everything and said she hoped I was happy. I calmly responded that I didn't ruin anything and that her actions and attitude did that all on their own. She huffed and drove away. The entitlement and harassment I had endured for weeks were finally over. Karma really does come through. I've always been a daddy's girl. Ever since I was little, I looked up to my dad like he was some kind of superhero. He worked hard 6 days a week to provide for our family. Weekends were sacred to him. They were his only chance to catch up on sleep and relax a bit. But even then, he'd make time for us kids. Our house wasn't anything fancy, but it was home. We had this massive front yard that felt like a whole park to me when I was younger. My sister, who's 5 years older than me, would often have her friends over. At first, I thought it was the coolest thing ever, having all these teenagers around. But as I got older, I started to see how it wore on Dad. I remember this one summer when I was about 11. School was out, and my sister's friends were over almost every day. Dad never complained, but I could see the tiredness in his eyes. He'd come home from work, grab a book, and sit out on the veranda, trying to find some peace. Our next-door neighbor was this woman who always seemed to have something to complain about. She'd peer over the fence, watching us like a hawk. I never understood why she cared so much about what we were doing. One night, my sister had just a few friends over. They were watching a movie, keeping it quiet because that was the golden rule. Never disturb Dad's rest. I was in my room, reading a book, when I heard a knock at the door. I called out to Dad, telling him someone was at the door. He grumbled back, wondering who it could be at such a late hour. I peeked out the window and saw 2 police officers standing there. Dad opened the door looking confused and a bit annoyed. He was in his old dressing gown, holding his book, with his cup of tea steaming on the table behind him. The police officer greeted Dad and explained that They'd received a noise complaint about a wild party at our address. Dad looked bewildered and asked if they were serious. The officer confirmed that's what was reported. Dad chuckled and pointed out the obvious lack of a party. He explained that my sister had just 3 friends over to watch a movie, and they'd left over half an hour ago. The police officers looked at each other, clearly confused. They apologized for disturbing us and wished Dad a good night. When they left, I saw Dad's face change. He wasn't just tired anymore, he was angry. He muttered under his breath, blaming our nosy neighbor for the false complaint. The next day was scorching hot. Usually, Dad would mow the lawn early to beat the heat, but not this time. He waited until just before 1 p.m., which I thought was strange. Dad winked at me and told me to watch, saying he was about to teach our neighbor a lesson. He fired up the mower and started cutting the grass in the most bizarre pattern I'd ever seen. He'd go up and down, side to side, and even diagonal. It was like he was drawing a maze with the mower. This went on for 2 whole hours. Just when I thought he was done, he dragged out this old metal box. Dad announced it was time to count the tent pegs. When I expressed confusion, he just grinned and told me I'd see. He started taking out these metal pegs one by one, standing up straight, and then throwing them onto the driveway with all his might. The noise was incredible. It sounded like someone was banging pots and pans right next to our neighbor's window. Then, he'd pick them up one by one and throw them back into the box. This went on for what felt like forever. I saw our neighbor come out a few times, giving Dad the dirtiest looks I'd ever seen, but she never said a word. When he finally finished, Dad was drenched in sweat and looked exhausted. But he had this smile on his face that I'll never forget. Dad wiped his brow and told me that sometimes you have to fight fire with fire, or in this case, noise with noise. I giggled and told him he was crazy. He admitted that maybe he was, but he bet we wouldn't be getting any more fake noise complaints. And you know what? We never did. Our neighbor seemed to learn her lesson. She still watched us like a hawk, but she never called the police on us again. From that day on, I saw my dad in a new light. He wasn't just the tired guy who worked all week. He was clever, funny, and knew how to stand up for himself and his family. It was a small act of rebellion, but it taught me an important lesson about not letting others push you around. Our neighbor eventually moved away a few years later, and I can't say we were sad to see her go. And you know what? My dad is truly my one and only hero. When I first applied for the job, I was just a broke college student looking for some extra cash. Little did I know, I'd end up dealing with all sorts of entitled people who think they can bend the rules to their will. It was supposed to be a typical Saturday morning. I'd been working at the theater for about a year, and I thought I'd seen it all. My co-worker and I were cleaning the halls, getting ready for the day's showings, when we noticed 2 women with a group of kids hanging around the entrance to 2 of our theaters. One of the movies was about to end, so I figured I'd check which one they were waiting for. I walked up to them and asked which movie they were going to watch. One of the women, who I'll call Karen because that's exactly who she turned out to be, said they were watching the movie that was about to start and asked if I knew the start time. I explained that I could tell her the start time if she showed me her ticket, as the time was written on it. That's when things started to go south. Karen revealed that their tickets were actually for the Minions movie, but they planned to watch this one while waiting for Avatar to start at 4. I blinked, trying to process what she'd just said. Did she really think that was okay? I tried to explain that they couldn't do that. Karen insisted that she could, claiming she did it all the time. I stood my ground and told her she either had to buy another ticket or leave. Karen then accused me of being new and suggested this must be a new rule. She demanded to speak to someone who actually knew the rules. I felt my patience wearing thin. I told her that I'd been working there long enough and this rule had been standard forever. 3 of my co-workers came over and backed me up, but Karen wasn't having it. She insisted we were all new and didn't know the rules, demanding to speak to a manager. I was grateful when my manager showed up. He's a cool guy in his mid-20s like most of us working there. He explained the same thing to Karen, but she still wouldn't budge. She insisted she wasn't wrong, claimed it was a new rule, and threatened to call the owner. By this point, I'd tuned her out. I'd dealt with difficult customers before, but this was next level. My manager asked them to leave and told me to walk with them to make sure they actually left the building. When we were walking out, Karen turned to me with the most obnoxious tone I've ever heard and said she was leaving, addressing me as Miss. Now I've got long hair, and I'm used to people mistaking me for a girl sometimes. Usually I just let it slide, but something about her attitude made me want to correct her. I told her I wasn't a miss. Karen's response was to snap back that it didn't matter if I was miss or ma'am. I could see the rage in her eyes when I told her I was a guy. It was like I personally offended her by existing. My manager came up to me after they'd gone and patted me on the back. He commended me for handling the situation well, noting that some people just can't accept that rules apply to them too. I nodded, still processing what had just happened, and thanked him for backing me up. He grinned and told me that he'd added them to our watch list explaining that if they tried to pull this stunt again, they'd be banned from the theater. That made me feel a bit better. Who knew a part-time job at a movie theater would involve so much drama? Well, you know what? Despite dealing with entitled people like Karen, I actually kind of love my job. Sure, it can be hellish at times, but the stories I get out of it are making my life far from boring. It started when I took a job as a lot attendant at a local car dealership, and after a couple of years of doing this, I could maneuver cars through tight spaces with my eyes closed. Little did I know this skill would come in handy in ways I never imagined. When my boyfriend and I finally saved up enough to move into our first apartment, we were ecstatic. The complex wasn't fancy, but it was ours. However, our excitement quickly faded when we realized the neighborhood had some quirks. The streets around our complex were a nightmare. Weird stop signs popped up in the oddest places, one-way streets appeared out of nowhere, and don't even get me started on the blind curves and intersections. It was like the city planner had a vendetta against common sense. But the real cherry on top, our neighbor was a blue Hyundai SUV. This person drove like they owned the roads, and everyone else was just an inconvenience. One morning, as I was coming home from my night shift, I saw the blue SUV zoom past a stop sign without even slowing down. I shook my head thinking it was a one-time thing. Day after day, I watched this person break every traffic rule in the book. They'd sit at one-way streets, waiting for other drivers to move, completely ignoring the signs. And don't even get me started on their parking. That SUV was always parked over the line, usually in the same spot every day. After a week of witnessing this behavior, I'd had enough. It was time to teach this person a lesson. The next morning, I got home just as the blue SUV owner was leaving for work. I waited until they pulled out, then slowly backed my car into the spot next to where they always parked. Using my dealership-honed skills, I inched as close to their usual spot as possible while staying within the lines. My collapsible mirrors came in handy, allowing me to get even closer. I climbed out through the trunk, feeling a bit like a spy in a movie. That evening, I heard a car door slam, followed by some colorful language. Peeking out the window, I saw the blue SUV owner glaring at my car, then at the space between our vehicles. They tried to squeeze in but gave up after realizing it was impossible without damaging their car. My boyfriend walked up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. He asked me what I was smiling about, and I told him I was just admiring my parking job. He looked out the window and commented on how impressive it was, wondering if the neighbor would get the message. I replied that if they didn't, I'd be happy to keep reminding them. And remind them I did. Every morning I park my car in that same spot, always within the lines but impossibly close to where they usually parked. Other neighbors started to notice, and I'd catch them grinning or giving me thumbs up when they saw my car. One morning, about 2 weeks into our little parking war, I came home to find a trash bag draped over my car. I sighed to myself, questioning if this was really the best they could do. I carefully removed the bag, making sure to accidentally rip it. Then, with a mischievous grin, I placed it on top of the blue SUV, right over their open sunroof. I muttered to myself that my hand had slipped. As luck would have it, it rained that day. I can only imagine the state of their car interior when they got home. This back and forth continued for a few months. Eventually, my boyfriend and I moved to a new place closer to my new job, finally in my field. And as we were packing up, I saw the blue SUV pull into their usual spot, taking up 2 spaces as always. I mentioned to my boyfriend that I thought I might miss this place. He asked if I meant the apartment or messing with our neighbor. Laughing, I said both and wondered aloud if they'd ever learn. My boyfriend doubted it but suggested that maybe the next person to move in would carry on my legacy. I might not have changed that driver's habits completely, but for a few months I'd made them think twice about their nonsense. And sometimes that's all the victory you need.